Okay, thank you very much. I'm actually going to deviate slightly before I go into the main presentation because, as was mentioned just now, the Treasury Select Committee has published their report on virtual currencies. So I had a quick scan through to look at the key points, and I thought I might read out a couple of the initial conclusions so you can get an idea of the direction of travel, because if you're working on projects or looking to work in this space, it's worth bearing in mind as to how the future landscape could look. So, they're generally quite critical, in some cases using quite strong language. So they say the FCA's consumer warnings are a feeble corrective to misleading advertisements. They strongly recommend that the FCA, which is a financial conduct authority, the financial services regulator in the United Kingdom, brings ICOs within their scope of oversight as a matter of urgency. There's different definitions of urgency. I don't think it's going to happen in the next few weeks. And they describe, and you'll probably see this in the media when they start to report on this over the next few days, they describe the current landscape in respect of crypto as a Wild West, which is not sustainable, partly because of the lack of certainty in the regulatory space. So we are probably going to see ICOs themselves brought within the framework or oversight of the FCA, which is good for lawyers. But what I found quite interesting, and I don't know the extent to which this will be covered, is this one, and I'll read it in full. If the UK develops an appropriate and proportionate regulatory environment for crypto assets, and if future innovations in crypto assets proved themselves as beneficial to society and industry, the UK could be well placed to become a global centre for this activity, providing that the crypto asset market adhered to high standards and was not associated with criminality. So it is going to be regulated, likely. And that is a good thing, because then you're going to have accountability, you're going to have people adhering to standards which are not necessarily voluntary and unenforceable, and it's going to add to the UK's reputation as a global finance centre of repute. And if they do that, and I'm involved in a parliamentary group on blockchain and slated to give evidence in January on crypto, and I'm also potentially, hopefully, going to be involved in the Law Commission's scoping study on potentially changing the law to accommodate smart contracts, then we could see some interesting developments in this space, not just from a UK perspective, but with ramifications globally. So with that little tangent, but reasonably important one, let's get on with the presentation. So I'm a fintech lawyer. That doesn't actually really mean anything. It just means I do commercial work, legal regulatory work, and finance work with a particular focus on financial technology. So peer-to-peer lending platforms, blockchain and crypto, and startups using things like APIs for open banking connectivity. So it's quite interesting. It's still the law at its heart, but it has applications in the technology space. And as someone who's a tech geek who somehow ended up as a lawyer, that is a nice blend, and it gets me out of bed each morning. So I'm quite happy with what I'm doing. So I joined the firm in April. We're a single site firm. We're not one of these large international ones, and we're based at 10FS. And I've been there for a few months now, starting to see quite a bit of crypto work coming in. We're doing stuff such as advising on tokenization projects on the regulatory side of things, the contractual elements, the wider issues to consider. We're doing opinions on certain ICOs as to whether or not they constitute a specified investment, which I'll go into shortly, and general work around that. So putting together privacy policies to comply with GDPR, terms and conditions, and all the legal bump that has to go with these projects. And if the government does introduce or regulations to bring ICOs within the FCA's remit, probably going to be very busy. So I thought it might be helpful, given there's a lot to go through in a short amount of time, to focus on three main areas. And there's a typo on this slide, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. They don't appear in the documents we produce, don't worry about that. We're going to look at structuring generally, which isn't specific to crypto, but it's worth considering. The difference between security and utility tokens from a UK regulatory perspective, and many of you might have read about how he tests and the approach the US takes. And then we're going to look at the potential need to comply with local laws and regulations when running an ICO. Skip that slide, it's not important for the moment. Right, structuring. So the reason I'm covering this in particular is because we actually had a meeting last week with a potential client, and they want to use DLTs for a particularly interesting application. Can't go into too much detail. But what became very apparent during the meeting, which was initially to discuss preparing a shareholders agreement, which I'll go into in a moment, was that these guys were very technically astute, had a brilliant idea and a great concept, but what they didn't have was the commercial or business experience to work out the basics of how to structure the company, who should hold the shares, and how should they all interact with each other. And these are considerations generally which any business starting out needs to take into account. Because if you don't get it right to start with, then you could run into all sorts of problems later down the line, not just in terms of protecting your product and the intellectual property, but also resolving disputes between shareholders. And so the starting point is, how are you going to do this? I mean, are you going to have just one company that does everything? Are you going to have one company that holds intellectual property, which is in a lot of cases the main value in the business? Are you going to have a company that's the operating company, and then an IP company, and then some other company, and it's all held together by a holding company which owns all of the other ones? Once you have a group of people and you're looking to found a project, how are you going to reflect your respective inputs? Someone might put equity in or money in. Other people might bring in their technical expertise. Other people might bring in contacts with potential investors. And so everyone needs to decide amongst themselves how that's going to be reflected and ultimately rewarded through the company structure. So it can be by shares, or it can be by some other means. But it's important to think about this stuff at the beginning. And if you all decide that at the start, then there's less risk of a dispute later on, and you can all focus on bringing this project to fruition and less time and legal fees in arguing about it if things go wrong or you all fall out. So it's important to consider at the outset what you're going to structure your project as in terms of companies, how you're going to agree things between each other. So you might have articles of association, which are the constitutional documents of a company. Every single company has them, and they're all publicly available for free. And they set out the basic rules which you're happy for the public to see and which are contractually binding on the company and its members. But on top of that, you can have something called a shareholders agreement, which is a private agreement between the shareholders of the company as to how they'll vote on certain matters, certain things that they can do or can't do without consent, and various other provisions which are always fact dependent, i.e. specific to each particular company, but which you wouldn't necessarily be comfortable having on a public website such as Companies House, where everybody can see what's been commercially agreed between the people involved in this business. So this sort of stuff is basic to any project, but it's important to get right. And if you do have that all set up, then you know that you've got the structure in place, you've thought about the future, you've got something ready and easily accessible so you can produce documentation to people who are later looking to invest in the company, and it just makes things a lot smoother later down the line. So that basically covers all that stuff up there. These slides get circulated, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Hopefully without the typo. Okay. Jurisdictions are interesting. We've seen some clients who have actually moved from the UK to other jurisdictions like Malta, Bermuda, other places, in part because of the regulatory environment around ICOs. In some cases, it's for tax efficiency. I have to be very careful with the choice of words there. And in other cases, it's simply because they've got other commercial reasons for relocating elsewhere. But as we're going to go into later on, just because you've got a company offshore which might be ICO friendly doesn't mean you're completely outside of ICO requirements in other jurisdictions worldwide. So it's another factor to consider. London in particular is a very good place to have a company, especially if you're going to undertake regulated activities, especially as ICOs are now likely going to be regulated. But also because you have the professional expertise here in terms of lawyers, accountants, business advisors, investment advisors, recruitment agents, that you're probably going to struggle to get in many other places around the world. You've got it all in one spot and in a place which is regarded as one of the global financial hubs in the world. So in terms of what's happening in this space, London really is one of the central hubs for it. The other key thing to consider, and it feeds into the structuring side of things, is governance. Now, setting aside protocol governance, which is one of my current areas of interest, and issues of weaponized consensus, which I'm happy to talk about at some point, but it's not related to the presentation, you need to think about what is going to happen in terms of how decisions are made for your business. So there are certain things under companies law which can only be passed by shareholders. These are called ordinary or special resolutions, and they require different percentages of shareholders to approve. They relate more to fundamental functions of the company. But in terms of making day-to-day decisions, you need to think about how you're going to do that. Is it going to be all of the directors just making the decisions? Are you going to have committees so that technical decisions can be made by a committee of directors focused on that purpose? You might have a finance committee to make finance or investment or debt decisions. And you might have an operational committee. You can structure it however you want. But it's stuff to think about, and it's important to ensure that you have systems in place to ensure that decision-making is done effectively by people who are well placed to make those decisions and avoid conflicts and conflicts of interest, and also to ensure that the decisions that are made are well documented and can be evidenced in future for potential investors, or if there's a dispute, or for simply good governance and accountability. There's also legal duties implied by law under the Companies Act 2006, which all directors have. And so it's important when you are starting a company to not assume that everyone who's a founder is going to be a director. You might have people who are willing to take on these legal duties and other people who are not but still want to contribute in some other capacity. If you're a director, you must follow these legal duties. They're very important and they're fundamental to how the corporate system works in the UK, because if you don't have accountability of directors, then companies theoretically can do whatever they want without any kind of recourse, either by shareholders or by customers or by investors or any other stakeholder, and there's not a lot that can be done. So this is why we have these directors' duties, and they look straightforward, but depending on the facts, they can sometimes be quite complex to ascertain, especially if someone is disgruntled by a decision the board has made and claims that a director has breached their duties by doing something they don't like, and that's where lawyers get involved. If I'm speaking too quickly, by the way, please let me know and I'll slow down. I'm just trying to get through as much content as possible and leave time for Q&A. So structuring, and this goes into funding as well, so you have to think about how you're actually going to get the money in to get this project off the ground, hire some staff, get some office space, and cover your initial costs. Lots of different ways of doing it. The initial founders might dip into their pockets and put their own equity in. You might have friends and family who decide to put some money in to get it going. You might have private equity, although you might need to get a little bit further along the line before you're in a position to attract that, whether it's early stage funding or full-on funding round. Potentially an ICO, although I'm not sure an ICO is necessarily the best way to fund an initial company to get off the ground. That might more be to get the project up and running. Or debt, which is simply borrowing money. Borrow money from a bank, might be from a private loan, from a shareholder or a director, or it could be some other way of structuring debt. Has anyone heard of the mini bonds, like the Brewdog bond and things like that? Yeah, so this is something called a mini bond, where a company wants to raise money. It doesn't necessarily want to go to offer more equity or list on capital markets, but it does want to raise money and it thinks it's in a position to return it. So it issues something called a mini bond, which is effectively a bond which pays some form of interest, and in Brewdog's case or some of these other companies, something a bit cool like free beer or free food or discounts off the services. So there's lots of different ways of structuring it, and it's important to work out which one is right for you, because everyone's going to have different requirements, every business has different roadmaps, and you've also got to think about what happens if things go wrong. It's also important to make sure, depending on the project you're doing, that you're not taking in money from lots of different people and the business itself actually invests in other businesses, because then you might potentially be undertaking something called a collective investment scheme, which is a regulated activity. So let's get into security and utility tokens. They're complex. It doesn't matter what you call them, it's what they do, which is what everybody looks at from a regulatory perspective. And the key pieces of regulation are the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, which the Regulated Activities Order is something derived from that. And the FSMA, as we call it, is the framework for financial services regulation and law in the United Kingdom. And it's through that that the FCA was created. And the reason this is important is because it is an offence, a criminal offence, to carry on a regulated activity in the United Kingdom unless you're authorised by the FCA or you're exempt, you fall outside of it. An activity is a regulated activity of a specified kind which is carried on by way of business, i.e. it's the way you get paid, and relates to an investment of a specified kind. And this goes to the ongoing question, are tokens utilities or securities? And my typical lawyer answer is, it depends. There is a list of specified activities, and they go into quite a bit of detail in the RAO. I'll go on back to that in a moment. And these are the specified investments. There's a lot of them. And because tokens are programmable with lots of different properties and qualities and can have contracts and agreements wrapped around them which confer certain rights, they could fall within one or more of these. And so what I've done is I've bolded some of the ones which are more likely to apply to a lot of projects based on what I've seen so far. They could be electronic money. They could be a form of shares, tokenized forms of equity, which is an interesting proposition. Instruments creating or acknowledging indebtedness, so any kind of token that gives you a right to receive money in return. Instruments giving entitlements to investments, so you could argue an SAFT, as sometimes used in the US, is one of these, or some equivalent as used in the UK. Certificates representing certain securities, I've not seen any of those yet, but there's no reason why that might not happen in future. And rights to or interest in other specified investments. So even something that gives you the right to an investment can itself be a specified investment. And if you're looking to work on a project to do an ICO, this is an important distinction to make because a lot of cryptocurrency exchanges are not authorized by the FCA to undertake buying and selling of specified investments. That's often deliberate, and it also means that they can't list tokens which are specified investments because otherwise they'd have to be authorized by the FCA, and they'll be in a lot of trouble if they don't. And of course, also, as I said in this previous slide, with collective investment schemes, you also can't undertake something that's a regulated activity in terms of your project unless you have FCA authorization. So one of the things we do is regulatory advice, and we're dealing with projects at the moment where people are looking to become electronic money institutions or payment services providers, and there's all sorts of implications around that as well. And you also might potentially be undertaking electronic money services, operating a payment service. You might be doing consumer credit. We're seeing now forms of crypto collateralization and borrowing against that. If it's to individuals, you might fall within the Consumer Credit Act. Gambling or e-gaming, and there's quite a lot of that going around, and there might be regulatory implications there. You might be operating an insurance business, or you might be undertaking what's deemed to be banking services. And so depending on what your project's looking to do, especially if it's in relation to financial services, you really do need to take the right advice at the right time. One other point I just wanted to very quickly touch on is in terms of equity. So because tokens do not necessarily confer share rights as if you were a shareholder, then there's a very important difference because shares give shareholders certain legal protections. They're set out under the Companies Act, including the right to bring a claim for unfair prejudice against the company, and also because you have your rights enshrined in a set of articles, which give you the voting rights, the dividend rights, and other rights, or a shareholders agreement. Tokens don't necessarily have that. Now, you may have tokens which are offered with certain terms and conditions associated with them as part of the investment agreement, but unless you have those in the investment agreement, the tokens don't have any other rights associated with them from a legal perspective. So it's important to make sure that you think carefully about what you want these tokens to do. And if you are trying to persuade people to invest in the tokens rather than invest in the company itself and have shares, you need to think about this stuff and work out how you can make it an attractive investment proposition. Because if you're an investor and you're going to invest in tokens which don't give you the same protections or right to receive assets if the company is liquidated, that's less attractive than taking shares in the company itself. And the shares in the company theoretically will grow in value as the company itself grows, whereas tokens, if they're listed on an exchange, are subject to the volatility that we're seeing at the moment. So it's another point to consider. So ICOs generally, you've got to consider what you're selling to where and to whom. Selling to retail investors is prohibited in some jurisdictions. So you've also got to research the jurisdiction you're looking to incorporate in if it's not the UK, and see whether you can even offer the ICO at all from a company in that jurisdiction. Always take local legal advice in the main markets that you're looking to promote into. In theory, it would be all markets, because there's certain concepts known as financial promotions and equivalent concepts, which if you're offering a particular product in a particular jurisdiction, you have to comply with. So it could mean making compliance with prospectus rules, which means you have to create a document similar to a white paper, but has certain requirements around it. And there's other activities which depend on each jurisdiction, which you have to follow, or you can do, or you can't do. So unfortunately, it involves in hiring more lawyers. So it doesn't matter where your company is based or what's behind the project, you may still need to take local advice to comply. If you say, well, my company is incorporated in the UK or some other jurisdiction, I'm compliant there, that's great locally, but it may affect your ability to promote the ICO elsewhere. So it's always important to ensure that you get the right advice early from the right advisors. So on that, just before you think I'm going to do a sales pitch, I'm kind of not. I'm just going to give you some general things to think about for getting this sort of thing up and running. So as we said, you may need advice in multiple jurisdictions. Obtain different quotes from different law firms and just give you a rough idea of what the market pricing might be. Also ensure that lawyers and the advisors do actually know what they're talking about, and you might want to ask them some questions to test their understanding, their past experience, some of the clients they've worked for, if they're willing to tell you or if they can tell you, and some of the issues they've seen come up. You're not necessarily going to get free advice. You might get more than likely going to get an initial meeting. We often meet with clients on an initial basis without a charge. and you can work out whether this is an advisor you want to work with. Involve advisors as early as possible. I've seen white papers with wildly unrealistic budgets for professionals. I saw one for like a couple of £1,000 for legal advice. I looked at that going, you're not going to get much for that. It's also important because, as I said before, in terms of structuring the company itself, if you get the right advice early, then you can make changes to your business plan or proceed with your business plan as you originally intended. If you go 75% of the way there, then get some advice, and actually you've done it wrong from a tax perspective, from a legal and regulatory perspective, you spend all that time and money putting that project so close to the finish line, but actually once you take that advice, couldn't do it the way you thought you did. So getting it early can save you a lot of time and money in the long run, and it also gives you the comfort and confidence to know that you're doing things within the perimeters of professional guidance. And you might not like the advice. We're not paid to tell you what you can do in the way you do it. We're paid to tell you what, based on what you've told us, can be done within the bounds of the law and regulation. We may say what you can't do, but we may also say what you can do. And it's important to hire professionals who understand what you're looking to do, who understand the wider market, understand, especially at the moment, legal and regulatory developments, and can bring all this to bear on your project. So even though you might not be able to do things one way, the lawyer might be able to find a different way for you to do things. There might need some tweaks here and there, and it's up to you if you follow the advice, but be prepared sometimes for news you might not particularly be happy with. You don't pay us to tell you what you want to hear. This can be high-stakes stuff, especially at the moment with this report coming out. We've got scams which are making high-profile stories in the press, and it's therefore likely that we're going to see regulatory action of some kind and potentially litigation from disgruntled investors against projects and ICOs worldwide in the coming months and years. From a regulatory perspective, they have the ability to enforce criminal sanctions, so it can be fines or even prison time. And if you have legal problems in future and you can show that you've taken regulatory advice that is appropriate and early, then it can protect you if there are investigations or enforcement action in future. So I think the key takeaway from this is you've got to think about the basics first, get the right advice, and think very carefully about doing the ICO. In some cases, you might find that actually investors don't want to invest in the ICO, they want to invest in the company itself. And so you'll find as your journey continues and this landscape rapidly changes, that trends and preferences and the law and regulation are going to adapt quite rapidly. So it's an interesting time to be in this space. If you're on a project, it might be a frustrating time. But I think there's a huge amount of potential there. And the fact that that Treasury Select Committee report is quite rightly in some cases critical, but also sees the potential if things are done properly, should hopefully hearten you that there's a lot of future and potential, not just in crypto, but also in London. But it's important to involve the right advisors at the right stage, get them involved early, get them involved along with you as the journey progresses, and I think you'll be in a good position to realize that vision you had in your head with your founders whenever the project idea came into your head. So that's pretty much it. Any questions? Oh, sorry, I've got to do a disclaimer, sorry. Right, got to be done. High-level presentation only, covering topics from a general perspective, obviously. Every business use case is different and will have its own specific requirements. Always take the right specialist legal advice at the outset, and this is a crucial one. Nothing in this presentation or any questions and answers constitutes or purports to constitute specific legal advice in respect of English law or otherwise on which you may rely. Neither Fox Williams LLP nor I accept any duty of care or liability to anyone in respect of anything covered in this presentation or any Q&A. Bottom line, you can't sue me for anything I've said. Cool, so I've kind of freestyled that, but happy to answer any questions. I can't give any specific legal advice if that slide didn't make it clear, but happy to answer any general questions if you have any. Questions for lawyers.
Hello, thanks very much. Just on the Treasury Select Committee, wondered what you think from that. Obviously, you only just briefly read it, but it doesn't sound like that's anything new.
No,
when do you think regulation might come in?
I think it's going to come in sooner rather than later. One of the other interesting points in their executive summary is they've noted that crypto is highly embedded in some sectors of society, and they think it's highly likely it's here to stay. And one of the disadvantages of a regulated market is all of the tricks and tactics that people used to be able to do in previous markets before they were regulated, they can now do in this market. So in some respects, regulation will help with preventing market abuse. help holding people to account. The obvious issue here, though, is that it's a global market, and therefore, unless there's coordination on a regulatory scale worldwide, and there might potentially be that, because the FCA has recently announced that they're going to cooperate or collaborate with, I think it's 11 regulators worldwide to create a global sandbox, we're potentially going to see some very interesting worldwide cooperation in this space. And the impression I get is that regulators are quite rightly concerned about what's going on at the moment. They do see the need for something that has to be put in place. And I think actually it's to everybody's benefit, not just because you're going to hire more lawyers, but generally because it gives you more comfort and certainty. And I think some of the people who might have been uncertain about investing in this space, whether on a significant level or even whatever level you care to imagine, might be more confident of getting involved if they know they have some protections, and if something goes wrong or someone does something blatantly fraudulent, then there's going to be some ramification from that. The other point I'd add to that is that advertising could potentially be affected by this as well. We've all seen the ads on Facebook before they banned it and then re-allowed it for some ICOs, which had some frankly ridiculous claims. So I think that's also a good thing. And anything that's going to help remove the negative optics around this is a good thing. It gets taken seriously, it's going to attract more talent, it's going to attract serious infrastructure around it, and it's going to be taken far more seriously than it is now as a form of capital raising, as a form of innovation, and finding solutions to problems that blockchain can actually solve, and not just doing an ICO and using the word blockchain and some clever sounding words. So I think there's a lot of potential, and I think the Treasury Select Committee seem to have taken a balanced approach. They're quite rightly scathing where they need to be, but I think they're taking a step in the right direction. So yeah, I think it's nothing out of the ordinary, but also positive encouragement that it is going to be regulated, hopefully. Personal opinions only, by the way, not speaking for my firm.
Crypto libertarians
Yes.
regard financial regulation as a conspiracy against the public.
Mm-hmm.
Lawyers are major actors in that conspiracy.
Yep.
What's your thought on distributed autonomous organisations like Orga, which are designed to avoid government regulation? Do you think these and similar organisations are going to become more powerful and perhaps even, as the crypto libertarians hope, disrupt the current system of regulation?
So let me declare my interest in this. I hold rep tokens. It's interesting because one of the interesting things I've seen on blockchain recently, and this is not a legal point, it's more a general observation, everyone's talked about decentralization and disintermediation. But actually what we've seen with a lot of projects is they're simply swapping out old school intermediaries for new intermediaries. So I'm trying to work out in that respect what's really changed. Then you're seeing proper decentralization, where once it's up and running, there's not much anyone can do about it because it kind of just goes on and on and on. So I think we're going to see lots of different things in this space. On the day-to-day basis, I see a lot of people using private blockchains because in many cases, why would you put confidential or sensitive information or business critical operations on a blockchain protocol which you have no control over the governance of? We might start seeing blockchain, private and public, once they become more interoperable, being used as the engines to power certain projects, rather than the whole thing itself being focused on blockchain, and it becomes a component. In terms of the crypto libertarian argument, I think we've seen the manipulation in the market and the scams and the frauds, which unfortunately show that if this space is ever going to have mainstream adoption that we'd all like it to have, it's going to have some sort of involvement, because human nature being human nature, if people can find a way to exploit other people, they will. And so the crypto libertarian argument was the impetus behind the creation of Bitcoin itself and some of the other tokens. But the practicality we're seeing on a day-to-day basis is not as decentralized as we like to believe it to be. And when you're seeing the huge amounts of money that are involved at the moment, I don't know if you saw the story about the potential Mt. Gox dormant Bitcoin whale that woke up and started dumping coins yesterday or day before. If you don't have some kind of oversight in this space, then there's a real risk that you're going to have a lot of people potentially coordinating together to really move this market in ways that's going to short a lot of people out. They're going to lose a lot of things. One of the points made in the Select Committee report was that there's real risk here for retail investors who don't understand this. And I've had friends who send me their Coinbase screenshot and not knowing what they're doing, they've bought Bitcoin on margin. My immediate response is, what on earth are you doing? Sell that right now. So you're trying to balance lots of different factors here. I think a pure libertarian argument is not going to work in practice when you've got a whole bunch of retail investors coming in. You're getting professional investors from all sorts of areas looking to come in, but want some sort of certainty. But also the practicality of what we're seeing at the moment with all this exploitation and manipulation and general skullduggery. So I have sympathy with the crypto libertarian argument. I just don't. When it comes to reality, however, it doesn't seem to hold up. And I think if it was to remain completely unregulated, I think a lot of people would start to move away from this space.
Thank you.
Okay, I apologize in advance for the question, but could you explain again the difference between a utility and security token from a legal standpoint?
Sure. So a security token is basically anything that does anything of this. It comes within the concept of a specified investment. So if the token does something which meets these criteria, then it's a specified investment and is therefore regulated. A utility token is anything that's not. So if it's something that purely gets you access rights onto a platform, for example, or doesn't guarantee a return of capital of some sort or a coupon payment or something like that, it may not be a utility. I can't say that for sure. It depends on each case, and you've always got to take legal advice. But in general, it's important to look at what properties you want the token to have and then get some legal advice on it. Because if you don't, and you go ahead with what you think it is, this law is changing on a fairly regular basis anyway, and law generally changes on a regular basis. And especially in this space with it being so fast moving, it's important to make sure that you don't have to spend sleepless nights worrying about whether you should have got a lawyer involved or not, and you've done what you think was the right thing to do, but actually, if you'd taken advice, it might have been a different output. So security tokens might meet these criteria, or you might think it's a security token, but a lawyer looks at it and goes, actually, I don't think it is.
Sorry,
Yep.
follow up. On this matter, how much is black and white, or how much is up to interpretation at the moment in the UK legal framework?
In terms of tokens themselves, it's always fact specific. So we always look at the white paper, we ask a bunch of questions, we then sit in a cold, dark room and then really look at the white paper and the regulation and try and do some analysis. In terms of the framework as a whole, at the moment it's not black and white, and that's one of the criticisms from the Treasury Select Committee. And I think generally, from our perspective, the security utility token argument is actually fairly easy to sort out. It then comes down to the other aspects of the project in some cases, especially if there's a financial services element to it. So you've got, for example, the payment services regulation, which sets out the regulatory framework for operating payment services. Interestingly, crypto, I don't think, really fits within that because it's not scriptural money, banknotes, or whatever the other definition is. But that could change. And then we've got the fourth money laundering directive as amended, but some people call it the fifth, which will require all crypto exchanges to undertake KYC AML on their customers. Most do anyway, to varying degrees of acceptability. And that's, again, another point that was raised in the report. So in some respects, the law as it stands kind of works. You have loopholes, as we're seeing, and as might be tightened up based on this, if these recommendations are accepted and implemented. But at the moment, depending on what you want to do, you can always find the right advice to help you understand where you stand. And that's one of the things we do with opinions, is we do a legal opinion backed by the name of the firm and our insurance. And we, in some cases, give that to our client who's doing an ICO, so they can then show it to a crypto exchange and say, hey, look, we've got lawyers in the UK who are pretty sure it's not not pretty sure, they are sure it's not a security, and therefore you're okay to list it. And what we're generally finding is the UK is very well regarded in the space as being a well-regulated jurisdiction, and it is. And therefore, the opinion of a UK law firm can carry weight for exchanges based in other countries, although, of course, we only comment on English law.
Yeah, some of the smaller jurisdictions like Gibraltar, Liechtenstein, Malta have been working quite hard to produce a fully fledged regulatory framework.
Yep.
Do you have any views on those and whether the UK will look to leverage them, and whether you would advise clients to go somewhere where they can rely on something that's been marked off as being complete?
So I'm going to give you a half answer to that. So I actually spent nearly 2 years in Guernsey, so I've got a bit of experience in offshore jurisdictions, and they're often in competition with each other. So they're always trying to find ways to innovate and offer something new and different and unique. So some are going down that path, some are going down other paths. Whether that's going to be something the UK emulates, I don't know. Also bearing in mind that these jurisdictions are self-standing jurisdictions. They've got their own laws, their own legal systems. So what works in one jurisdiction might not work in another or in the UK. Some things they might take and implement into the UK, but with the nature of this jurisdiction and the fact that it is by a large majority the preferred jurisdiction of choice for business, that's got to be borne into mind as well. So you haven't got the flexibility and the agility that you have in offshore jurisdictions to make new law, but when new law is made here, you've seen the consultation process has gone through, you've got working groups, you've got the law commission looking at changes in the law, you've got all these different parties with different focuses and specialisms looking at what needs to be done and focusing on their particular area, and then that's all going to feed in, and then government makes a decision. So I don't know.
I have a question before.
Lots of questions, wow.
Two. So first question is, do you think ICOs should be regulated on their websites and social media pages, same as you have cigarettes, and there is a law that says on every pack of cigarette, it needs to, be written with big letters, this is risky, like this is a highly volatile market, don't invest if you don't know what you're doing. So do you think that will help? That's the first question. And the second question is, the reason why ICOs are appealing is because it's very easy for regular people to get in. Whereas for years, it was very hard for regular people to invest in companies because, paperwork and stuff like that. Question is, do you think the government need to make it easier for regular people like me to invest in companies, and therefore they will not look at ICOs because it's easy for them to invest in companies? Do you think that's the solution?
So answering your first question in terms of will regulation of advertisements for ICOs help, yes, I think they will. Because if it is brought within the auspices of the FCA, then making financial promotions in respect to specified investments is something which falls within law and regulation, and therefore there's certain things you can do, certain things you can't do, and certain things documents have to contain. And I think that's a good thing, because we've seen a lot of ICOs where in some cases what they were offering didn't match up with reality, and if you didn't know and didn't do your own due diligence, then you might have been burnt. You've also got to bear in mind that even buying and holding crypto itself is not an easy process. You've got to register, you've got to do KYC, you've got to buy the token, you've got to work out which ones you're going to buy, you've got to get a wallet, you've got to send the funds to the wallet to the right address, and then work out what to do afterwards. And then you have all sorts of issues with the wallets themselves potentially being vulnerable. So I think actually the bar to entry to get into this space at all is reasonably high at the moment. It may get easier over time, but it's not something you can just walk off the street and do, not with any degree of confidence anyway. In terms of the second question, it's an interesting one. So I'm trying to work out how to formulate the answer. I'm not sure, is the honest answer. We're getting to a point now where this is starting to be taken seriously. We're seeing large investment houses start to go in. And yes, there is an extent to which retail investors can't access certain investments, but that's mainly for their own protection. Because what we have seen in the past is people who have put pension funds or retirement savings into a project, and they might have been misled, or they might not have done sufficient research, and in some cases the business model just wasn't sound. But if you didn't have experience in this space, as someone who makes investments on a regular basis, you may not be able to make that distinction. You can already invest in startups through seeders and other websites, but you have to be able to show that you know what the risks are, that you could stand to lose all your money. Same with ICOs, and I think everyone needs to understand that an ICO, like any other investment, carries risk. Some cases return on capital, some cases is return of capital. It's a risky space, it's a volatile space, and I think people need to know that before they make these decisions. And that's why I think regulation and the safeguards that come with it, yes, from a crypto libertarian perspective, that goes against the grain. But I think if you look at the reality of what's gone on in the last 12 to 18 months, I think it's necessary. Oh.
Hi. Since you also advise on peer-to-peer lenders, I was wondering what is the regulatory framework for decentralized debt or decentralized loans? I think that there are some very early applications of it, but let's say someone wants to set up an application in the UK that people can lend Ethereum to each other with interest. What is the regulatory framework around that?
So peer-to-peer peer-to-peer platforms are governed by something called Article 36H of the RAO, and it was something which actually industry liaised with the FCA to create. So when peer-to-peer platforms first came about, they weren't regulated, and they said, can you please regulate us? And that's how we got 36H. As to crypto, we've not actually come across any peer-to-peer platforms yet. That doesn't mean that people aren't looking to do them. I've not come across anything using MakerDAI or CDPs or anything like that yet. But I do think we'll get to a point where people want liquidity and people want to do something with their crypto rather than just hold it, or in some cases actively manage it depending on what they hold. So I do think we'll see that. Again, huge amounts of risk involved, especially if there's defaults, working out how you're going to collateralize it, if you're going to collateralize it, who's going to collateralize it, how it's going to be held, all sorts of things to bear in mind there. And whilst it's not technically currency, we might get to the point where you treat it as if it was. I don't know. I've not come across that yet.
So do you think there is a business potential for a legal tech platform to fold all of this into a smart contract and approach the legal authorities with a smart contract? I mean, at the end of the day, all these articles that you talk about are code, aren't they?
It's interesting because I've actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, and I'm on a Slack for Open Law, which is a consensus spoke, I think this is the word they use, which is looking to take regular legal documents and have them interact with each other. It's not necessarily going to automate the process, it's just going to drive efficiencies and have document interoperability. What I think is going to happen is, and I would say this, so take this as you will, you're always going to need lawyers. You're not going to be able to fully automate the process. Every deal is different, whether it's setting up a company, whether it's getting the articles in place, and getting investments and debt involved. And each deal has its own terms, and they're usually heavily negotiated on the commercial side. But then you have to negotiate with legal terms as well. And there's ways you can make that process automated to some extent, but you're still going to need human input to consider the commercial aspects, to negotiate the legal aspects, to look at what's been suggested and think about the legal implications, which again might be different for each project. So I think automation and AI certainly has its place. And in some cases, it's going to be very, very useful because it will save you going through a document and making sure the definitions match up and putting your semicolons and clauses in the right place. But in other respects, it's not going to replace the fundamental analysis that goes on for most of the more complex work in terms of deal negotiation or contract negotiation. But there are quite a few legal tech firms out there already. So there's Open Law, there's Agrello, quite a few others, Legal Things, and a few other bits and pieces. So it is evolving in this space. And law generally, traditionally, has been slow to catch on to tech. We're actually seeing quite a few firms use AI and play around with all these sorts of technologies to try and drive efficiencies, which ultimately means that lawyers are freed up to focus on what they're trained for, which is the law and negotiation, and also make sure that there's less time turning standard form documents around, which means hopefully the cost savings can be passed on to the client.
Yeah, this is more about sort of competition in your own sphere. Obviously, the legal area, of blockchain is growing. Do you know sort of about your own competition in terms of like if our project, for instance, if we're looking for sort of legal counsel, would we have to pick up 100 firms, or would it be 50 firms, 10? You're a smaller shop yourself. Well, I say small. You're not a multinational, but what's the sort of legal landscape in terms of sort of blockchain counsel?
Well, hopefully we'll get to the point in the next couple of years you can pick up the phone to any firm and they'll be able to help you. In terms of a lot of the work, it's fundamentally the same work as for any other project. The interesting aspects come in when you consider the regulatory side of things or some of the more specialist elements. There are some very good firms and some very good lawyers in this city. It's partly why I moved here, because I wanted to be in this space full time and surrounded by people far smarter than I am on the legal and non-legal side, which is not hard to do. And what I found interesting is that different lawyers have different approaches to this. So some lawyers focus on crypto funds, and funds is a whole other kettle of fish to what I do. And then you have lawyers who focus on the regulatory side, lawyers who focus on the employment aspect and getting immigration visas. So if you want to bring someone in who's an absolute technical genius, then you can do that. And so there's different lawyers doing different aspects in this space. In terms of firms themselves, there's a few very good ones. And of course, I count our firm in that. But if you come to us and say, I want to set up a crypto fund, we probably refer the actual fund formation out to another firm, because that's just not what we do. So it's important to look at the credentials of the firm itself, look at the credentials of the lawyers involved, and then see what their experience is. What sort of work have they actually done? What issues have they come up? I think I touched on that before. We are seeing more firms getting into this space, which is always a good thing, because I think it's important to have as much choice as possible. Also drives competition, also drives innovation. One of the fundamental issues, though, is lawyers are very, very busy. So I did 14 hours on Monday, for example, so didn't have much time to read up on current developments in crypto. So because of the fact that, as you pointed out before, you have to do a lot of reading on your own time as a dev, especially in this space, you have to do a lot of reading in your own time as a lawyer, because there's no regular or easily accessible source in some cases. You have to kind of pull different pieces together and then sit down and think about it and look at the issues. So I had a very interesting chat a few weeks ago with the QC about some of the issues associated with sale and purchase of cryptocurrency and how you document that and how you treat it and all that sort of stuff. So there are some very good people in this space. And I think if you do a bit of digging, most of the firm sites are well SEO optimized, and most of them will have some form of digital assets service or cryptocurrency blockchain service, and then look at what they do and what sort of advice they offer, and whether you need specialist advice from one particular aspect or whether you want a firm that can handle everything. So there are quite a few firms who do it. There's some very good lawyers who do it. I do actually wish there was a lot more lawyers in this space, because then I'd have plenty of people to meet up with and shoot the breeze with. Yeah, I'm absolutely all in favour of competition. What I will say, though, is in terms of advising on the ICO, some firms are more particular than others, partly because it might be that the startup simply doesn't have enough money to pay the fees, depending on the advice they need. It might be something like, for example, e-gambling or gaming. We don't do that because we don't do any regulatory work in the gambling area. So if someone came to us on ICO and said, oh, here's 20 grand up front, can you do our ICO for us? If there's a regulatory or element in respect of gambling or e-gaming, we'd have to say, I'm sorry, we don't do regulatory work in that area. So you've got to work out whether the firm is right for you and for your project, and then make sure that they've got the experience and expertise to be able to give you the right advice.
Incredible. Can we get a big hand of applause for Mr. Marc Piano?
Thank you.